Okay, welcome back, everybody. Our second speaker is Dr. Maria Tomaso-Peterson. Dr. Peterson is a research professor in plant pathology at Mississippi State University with an 80% research, 20% teaching appointment, which consists of a split-level course, Turfgrass diseases. Dr. Tomaso-Peterson has over 25 years of turfgrass pathology experience. Her areas of interest include disease management strategies for warm season turfgrasses, fungicide resistance, and mechanisms that confer resistance in turfgrass pathogens, and the characterization of novel pathogens and diseases, most notably Carularia malina, a causal agent of ink spot in zoysia grass and Bermuda grass. Currently, her efforts focus on novel fungal complex associated with Bermuda grass decline. Welcome, Maria. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Welcome everybody from Mississippi State University. We're having a nice, hot, and humid day today. Lots of rain in our area, unlike what Dr. Kearns is experiencing in North Carolina. So we've had just a lot of rain, and that is just perfect for diseases in turfgrass. So this morning, I was going to talk about some of the diseases most prominent in our southern residential and commercial turfgrasses. First, before I start, I want to make sure everybody can see the screen. Do we have it set up correctly?
We sure do. Looks great.
Okay, so all I have to do is go ahead and start. So let's see. I'm trying to advance it. Okay. Did it advance for you guys? I just want to make sure.
Not quite yet. We're still seeing what looks like your whole slide deck.
Okay. Let me,
It looks like PowerPoint may have a couple of windows open.
okay. Let me go to this one. How's that?
Looking good if you can hit that display settings.
Right. See, I think that's what I did earlier. Duplicate?
Go ahead and click the swap presenter.
Oh, okay.
And that looks perfect, Maria.
Okay, great. Now I'm going to move this dialog box over here. Okay, so let's get started. So the first thing I like to talk about in plant pathology, it's a pretty complex system. Well, why doesn't it advance? How about this? Okay.
There we go.
Complex system, which includes some very important factors. So we're just going to review those briefly. And I like this bullseye area because right here in the middle is very important. The first thing we deal with in disease is a susceptible host, and in our instance, it's the turfgrass plant. So we have that susceptible host out there, and it's there all the time because our host is a perennial. And then our second factor is the pathogen. Well, this pathogen is there all the time as well. They don't just, come and go and pop in and out of that turf microclimate. But the one thing that really influences this disease bullseye right here in the middle is that conducive environment. And like what we're experiencing here in Mississippi and part of the deep South in Alabama as well, is that conducive environment, which makes up the temperature, the moisture, but also the environment, the physical aspects in which that grass is growing, such as you're trying to grow Bermuda grass in shade. Well, Bermuda grass is not very shade tolerant, so that might influence its susceptibility to pathogens because it's in an environment that's not conducive for the host. So with these concepts in mind, when they all come together, we have disease. And that's what I've been working with and studying for a long time. I love it. It's very interesting and it's a dynamic career for me in what's going on. So here I want to start with large patch. Large patch and warm season grasses. It's caused by the fungus Rhizoctonia solani, which is a soil-borne fungus, so it's there all the time. This pathogen not only causes diseases in turf grasses, all turf grass species, but in our crops, our bedding plants. It infects over 500 species, plant species, so it's very ubiquitous fungus, so it's everywhere. And when we see it in warm season grasses, we call it large patch. Now, Dr. Kearns was just talking about brown patch. Brown patch is also caused by Rhizoctonia solani, but in cool season grasses, we refer to it as brown patch. In warm season grasses, we refer to it as large patch. And you can see here in this athletic field, it's a Bermuda grass field, how big those patches are. So we kind of use those two terms to kind of separate out our cool season grasses and our warm season grasses. So for my presentation, I'm going to be concentrating on the warm season grasses in the southern states, deep south, and that will consist of, with large patch, all of our warm season grasses. So when do we see the symptoms like we're seeing here on the screen? Typically, depending on the latitude where you're at, it's going to start around September to November. And then again, we're going to see that same disease epidemic in April and May, again, depending on that environment. The temperature that's most conducive for the fungus to infect is 68 to 77 degrees, so quite a moderate temperature. Again, high humidity with that conducive environment. Low light intensity also promotes the disease, not a lot of high light like we would get under our high pressure systems. So more of a low pressure type weather event. High nitrogen, well, Dr. Kearns talked about that in his tall fescue, which was very interesting. But in our warm season grasses, just anecdotally, when we see homeowners or sports fields where they really push nitrogen early in the season, we just observe a greater prevalence of the large patch epidemic. One thing that I like to stress about the environment in which that grass is growing that's conducive to getting large patch is the poorly drained soil or that thatchy area. So when you're walking through your sports field or your home lawns or residential turf, whatever you're managing, and you're walking through there and the sole of your foot, your shoe gets wet, just walking through there, that's the type of environment that is conducive for large patch, and that's where you're going to see the symptoms first. Now, contrary to the cool season grasses, another difference in our warm season grasses is the fungus infects the leaf sheath. So you're not going to see the distinct lesions on the leaf itself, but you have to go down and look at that leaf sheath because that's where the infection starts. So here I've got a picture of the leaf sheath like I was talking about just now. This is St. Augustine grass and it's flipped upside down. So here you have the leaf sheath And you'll see right here where it separates off the base of that stolon, and it kind of pulls off. And you'll see that dark necrosis and is working its way up towards the leaf, but and it's kind of a wet looking rot that you'll see with a little bit of a margin of a lesion working its way up. The best way to tell whether there's large patch in the turf is to go to the very edge of that leaf sheet of the area in which the perimeter where that disease epidemic is occurring. And if you go in there, whether it's Bermuda grass, zoysia grass, centipede, St. Augustine, you can take that plant, and because they're stoloniferous, you take that plant and it'll just readily remove from the stolon, and you'll see a break like this. So it just sloughs off. And that's because the fungus is rotting this area right in here with the infection, and it'll just break off. Now this area on these big patches, typically you're going to see a bright orange color when the disease is active and it's at the perimeter of this very large patch. Now these patches are pretty much radial and uniform because the fungus typically starts at one point in the turf and over time expands out radially and grows like this. And that's why you see that large radial growth habit. So let's look at the disease cycle. So here in the center, we have a beautiful, healthy St. Augustine. And then we kind of come around and cycle through. And these are the different seasons in which that grass is growing. So we have our summertime where the grass is healthy, our warm season grass. And like I mentioned, the disease is most prevalent in the spring and fall of the year. And that's because our warm season grasses during the fall and the spring are undergoing transition. So they're shutting down, slowing down physiologically, sending their carbohydrates down into the root and system, the rhizomes, and they're more stressed. So they're physiologically stressed and more vulnerable to infection. So with this cycle that we see here, we use that to go through and pretty much put together a fungicide application spray time. So we typically don't spray for brown patch or large patch in the summer on our warm season grasses because they're growing healthy. The fungus is still there, but the grass is healthy and growing and not as susceptible. But like in the fall of the year, when we start to slow down, this is when we like to put in our applications, and a preventative application is the best way to go to manage large patch. And depending on where you're located, the first application would go out in September to October, followed up 28 days typically with a October to November application. So if you're starting in September, usually the area around Memphis, Tennessee going across is a good September, late September, maybe the third week of September. Down on the Gulf Coast, you might start in October. Then what we've seen in our research is going into the springtime, we want to put out a preventative application at about 50% green up. So what are we going to use? We've looked at many different fungicides for management of large patch. And the first group I was going to talk about are the strobilurins or the QOIs. Dr. Kearns has also mentioned these. Heritage, Fame, Insignia, and Compass is the group of QOIs that are labeled for turf diseases. And I was going to show you here a study that we did at Mississippi State to prevent large patch, and this is on zoysia grass. Zoysia grass seems to be very susceptible to large patch. So all my graphs that you'll see today are going to be set up with the x-axis area under the disease progress curve value, which is the cumulative amount of disease we see in that season. So here we have a check, and we've got the numbers because, or the letters, because there's significant difference. So you can see the value is 35 for the check, which we had a little bit of an epidemic, not much. But even with that, we sprayed these fungicides that you see listed on the y-axis and the value of disease associated with them. So we'll start down here with the heritage, which is azoxystrobin, a singular product. Heritage plus Secure, which was a tank mix. Headway, which Dr. Kearns mentioned, that has azoxystrobin and propiconazole in it, works well together. And Brisquet is a product that has azoxystrobin in it, plus a DMI difenoconazole. So with that B being here on all of these products, we're getting significantly better control of large patch, despite the epidemic being somewhat minimal. So when we look at large patch management with the demethylation inhibitors or the DMIs, these fungicides are labeled for brown patch. Myclobutanil, here's propiconazole alone, tebuconazole, Torque or Mirage. Tridimethon is Balaton, tridiconazole in the product Trinity or Triton, as well as polyoxin D, which is not a DMI, and the PCNB being labeled. We did a study at Mississippi State again on zoysia grass, but looking at the efficacy of the DMI Mirage. So again, we have our x-axis with the accumulative amount of disease and our check down at the bottom. So we had a minor epidemic in the fall. And going through these products and the timing of the product, we're going to start at the top with Valista, which is penthylpyrad, and that was put in as a standard. And we applied it here at Mississippi State October 6th and November 3rd. Armada is a Balaton plus Compass at 1.5 ounces. Again, same date application, October 6th and November 3rd. This Mirage was a curative application, which we didn't apply in the fall. Therefore, you're going to see a similar disease symptoms and AUDPC as our untreated check for the fall, because nothing was sprayed in this plot. Then we were looking at Mirage, which is tebuconazole at October 6th, one application, Mirage October 6th and November 3rd, and then Mirage October 3rd and October 6th and November 3rd. So this is our fall application, and we got good control with all of our fungicides. But then again, we're going to move into the springtime. And our springtime application, the spring is in the green here, and you can see based on the AUDPC and the untreated check that we had a significant epidemic of large patch in our zoysia grass. Spring seems to be the greatest amount of disease, especially followed by a fall that had a low level of epidemic. It just blows up in the spring. So if we go back and look again at the top, starting with Valista, we did have some level of disease, but we had control. This Armada, we had more disease, but similar, because you see the bees that it shares with. So here we have that curative where in the fall we didn't apply any fungicide, but in the spring we did. So we did get some control, but you know, there was still a lot of scarring left from that area that was untreated in the fall. When we applied Mirage in October, then followed a spring application, which was March 30th, we did receive a good level of control. But the product that seemed to provide the best control overall with reduced symptoms was the Mirage, where we put out the 2 applications in the fall and then followed up with the spring application. And looking at just the fall application only, we did get a little bit of a breakout in the springtime. So with that, if you're going to look for a program to give you the best control and minimize the scarring that can be left from the large patch infestation, excuse me, the 2 applications in the fall and followed up by a March application in the springtime provides the best control. So then another group of fungicides, the succinate dehydrogenase inhibitors, that includes ProStar, which is flutolenil, always a great product for large patch, as well as fairy ring. But those are the only 2 diseases that it, you know, is effective on. So it's very limited in the, you know, what this product can control. So with the new generation of the SDHIs, that includes exemplar, fluxapyroxid, Xterra Stress Guard, fluopiram plus trifloxystrobin, and Valista penthiopyrad. The nice thing about these products is they're more broad spectrum, so they don't work only on the large patch, but other diseases as well. So with that in mind, we did a study, and this was on St. Augustine grass large patch management. So we included ProStar flutolenil, and again, we're using that same application timing, October 6th and November 3rd. That's our 28-day standard. At the x-axis, again, we have our amount of disease, which in the fall was pretty limited. But even with that, when we applied the exemplar fluxapyroxid, and we did October 6th, then we followed that up with Pillar, which is tridaconazole plus pyraclostrobin, and that's a granular. We didn't see any large patch. Then when we looked at exemplar at October 6th, followed up 21-day applications 3 times in the fall, no disease, and then just 2 applications at 21 days, no disease. So this is our fall, but going into the spring epidemic, you can see we had a large level of large patch on our untreated check. Spring is the green. And we had a little bit of a breakout with just the 2 21-day applications of exemplar in the fall of the year. We had good control when we put out exemplar 3 applications 21 days apart in the fall only. And then in the exemplar, we put out an October 6th and a March 22nd. So this was our spring application. And again, the pillar was applied in the fall. With the flutolenil, our standard for the SDHIs, we got good control. So basically where you see the C's on here, very good control and significantly better than if we didn't spray anything. And with that 21-day 3 apps in the fall with exemplar, the SDHI, we received 98% control. So in looking at the plots, these were taken in April. On the left, you have the untreated check, and you can see the turf quality is significantly reduced. A lot of bare areas, and that's because of the large patch and how that Rhizoctonia solani breaks down that leaf tissue and leaves a scarring effect. So then we had the 2 applications of Exemplar, and here's your 3 applications, which provided the 98% control in this area. But you can see our turf quality was very good in all those plots where we applied a fungicide. So now not only do you have to keep in mind that you want to apply a fungicide, but there's also the spray volume is important. And again, the ideal spray volume would be 2.5 to 4 gallons per thousand, or 109 to 174 gallons per acre. But typically, in a lot of our spray situations, depending on your tank, you might only get 1 to 1.5 gallons per thousand. So with that, you would want to then immediately follow up with an irrigation, a very light irrigation of that fungicide, so it gets down into that stolen crown region, down into the turf canopy, because that's where the Rhizoctonia is, and it's infecting. And again, it targets that leaf sheath. So you want to put that fungicide down into the region where the fungus is actively infecting. So with that, sometimes we see some crazy diseases. This one I call square patch, caused by Homo sapiens. Sometimes we see this in home lawns across our residential areas. When the grass is green, it appears, and it appears as a chlorosis or necrosis, sometimes in a perfect square, due to lack of sunlight, high temperature stress. So the management, what are we going to do? Well, maybe we need to take our garbage cans and the lid of the garbage can and bring it back to the house instead of leaving it on the grass. So this is just an example of some of the things I'm sure we all have seen in our home lawns, in residential areas, plus a lack of good management in mowing practices. But moving on to something a little bit more serious in our worm season grasses, our 2 foliar diseases, dollar spot and leaf spot. And it's most prevalent in our area in the Bermuda grass and zoysia grass turf situations, not quite as much in the centipede grass and St. Augustine grasses that we grow in the deep south. These disease epidemics can last throughout the growing season. So basically from the time of green up in the spring to the time of transition in the fall of the year, we can see these diseases. They occur under moderate temperatures, 70 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, but that relative humidity, that environmental aspect, is very important for this disease, both these diseases to occur. And sometimes we'll see, especially dollar spot, occur under drought stress conditions, or then at the other end of the spectrum, excessive moisture. And leaf spot tends to explode under excessive moisture. So with the rains we're seeing here in the south it's been over 30 days, there's a lot of dollar spot, and we're seeing a lot of leaf spot in our worm season grasses. Again, nitrogen may play a role, especially in dollar spot, when we have nitrogen starved lawns, turf situations, dollar spot is more prevalent. I've done studies looking at leaf spot and nitrogen up to 2 pounds per thousand. And the only difference we saw is the more that turf grass was susceptible to leaf spot, the greater leaf spot epidemic. So it really didn't influence an increase of disease the most important thing we saw in that study was the genotype and whether it was susceptible or highly susceptible to leaf spot. So we're going to start with dollar spot, talking about that and looking at some of the symptoms. And I'm putting these together because they get confused, and a diagnosis is the most important thing to let the turf practitioner know whether or not they're managing the dollar spot or leaf spot. So a few tricks with the dollar spot. You can see the photo on the left in the turf. It looks very light colored, almost a bleached straw color. And then when you go in and look at the foliar symptoms, you'll see again that necrosis, that blighting caused by the fungus, is very bright white straw color. And there's always a delineation between the infected turf plant and the healthy, with this very dark brown, almost maroon colored margin. And that's the margin of the lesion. And sometimes you'll see the lesions small, circular, but then they expand across the leaf, creating a banded lesion. So then looking at leaf spot, again, we get the thinning turf, but with the leaf spot, as you see the image on the left, that necrosis is more of a rusty dark brown, almost a purplish color. So the color itself in the turf is very different than dollar spot. And then when you look at the leaves that are affected, you're going to see more of pinpoint tiny lesions, and then just a severe blighting occur with not a lot of delineation like you would see with dollar spot, as well as you can tell the color of that blighted plant leaf is different. It's darker, kind of more of a reddish color. And then the symptoms in the overall turf stand with the dollar spot, you might see a more, and especially in tall or higher mowed turf, kind of a little patches, maybe a few inches in diameter, but then they can coalesce to form an irregular blighted area in the turf. And with the leaf spot, there's no real distinct circular patch or anything. It's just diffused throughout the turf, kind of mimicking a lot of times desiccation, and it looks like the turf is drying out, but really it's the leaf spot in there. So with that, these diseases can be easily confused. So getting a diagnosis from your local plant diagnostic lab, will help in that, because the management of these two diseases are a little bit different. So again, looking at dollar spot, the banded lesions on the left, the dark purple margins, the white straw color, those are real good indicators that you can make a diagnosis out in the turf if you look closely at the plant itself. Whereas with leaf spot, you have those dark purple, starting with little pinpoint lesions that fleck that leaf material, and it spreads across, turning the leaf blackish brown before it blights out. So looking at dollar spot and leaf spot management, this picture on this high school baseball field came to us during the summertime, and it's just blighted out. It looks like it could be just desiccation, but that is dollar spot. And the epidemic is so widespread that you can see the necrotic areas of turf, and it just coalesced to make just very broad areas that without a diagnosis or looking at that plant, you cannot tell what's going on in that turf. So with these foliar diseases, especially in dollar spot, you want to manage the nitrogen according to the turfgrass host. Manage the leaf and soil moisture with proper irrigation timing, meaning irrigate early in the morning while dew is present, so you're not adding another extended period of dew. So then when the sun comes up, that grass can naturally dry out. Or don't start irrigating in the early evening when the dew has not started to develop yet. Or, if you have a dry evening and there's not a lot of humidity, you don't want to put that wetness on that grass and let it extend into the night, because that leaf wetness provides an environment to promote the infection of these fungi. Proper height of cut is very important with these different grasses and dollar spot and leaf spot management. Now, looking at fungicide management, we have the demethylation fungicides labeled, and primarily in the spring and fall applications on the worm season grasses. You don't want to put these DMIs out in the summertime when the temperature is high. Typically 75 to 80 degrees is the limit, because if these are applied when it's hotter, we'll get a phytotoxic response, and that would probably play out more in a yellowing of the turf, and it'll set it back some, so it won't heal as quickly. The strobilurins are very good for dollar spot and especially leaf spot management, but I have this asterisk here because one of the QOIs we use readily, azoxystrobin, which is heritage, will increase dollar spot epidemics. So that's the one strobe that you don't want to apply if you see dollar spot. And a lot of times in the home lawn and commercial turfs, you're going to see both of these diseases occurring at the same time. So if you go out and say, well, I'm going to apply heritage and this will control both foliar diseases, you're probably going to see an increase in that dollar spot. So you want to really know if dollar spot is out there before you apply azoxystrobin. So with that in mind, you might want to go to a different strobilurin or even a different chemical class, such as dicarboxamides, which would be iprodione, and then the SDHIs we talked about, the new generation that are labeled for dollar spot and leaf spot. So moving on to another disease in our warm season grasses that tends to be a very disruptive and a very difficult disease to control is take-all root rot. And the reason this disease is more challenging to the turfgrass managers and even in the plant pathologists is because it's a root rot disease. The diseases I was talking about earlier are foliar, so much more readily controlled with management and fungicides. But the take-all root rot caused by Gamenomyces graminis, again, it's soil-borne, but it attacks the roots. Very prevalent in our St. Augustine and centipede grasses. We see it frequently in our zoysia grasses, and in the residential commercial turf, not so much in Bermuda grass due to the height of cut and the reduced management. But on golf courses, it's very significant disease on our Bermuda grass putting greens, tee boxes, due to that high management. But as you can see, the picture on the right is a St. Augustine home lawn where we have thinning turf, and it's just irregular areas where the turf will thin out. And with that thinning, we're going to see crabgrass and Dallas grass and even Bermuda grass come in and occupy those areas that where we see the death of that plant in those void areas. So then we have that problem with weed encroachment. We see the symptoms under summer, typically during stress periods. A lot of times we'll see at the end of July and into August, especially when we have dry temperatures, because keep in mind it's a root fungus, so it's actively infecting throughout the growing season. And so when those plants get under moisture stress, we start to see the thinning and the death of those plants. It is also significant, this height of cut. A lot of times in our area where we see Bermuda grass, centipede grass, zoysia grass, St. Augustine grass management, sometimes lawn care operators will come through and they won't adjust their height of cut depending on their turf that they're cutting. So they set it at a low height for Bermuda grass and they cut all their lawns at that same height. Well, our St. Augustine and centipede grasses cannot tolerate low mowing heights. So when these grasses are under that low mowing height, we tend to see the symptoms and the voided areas caused by the take-all root rot more so than if that grass is maintained at the proper height of cut, 2.5 inches to 3 inches. The disease tends to be more prevalent under a higher soil pH at 6.5 or above. Some soil pHs we see around 8 and very active take-all root rot. Also associated with the disease epidemic is low soil potassium. So getting soil tests and looking at that potassium level in areas where you think there's take-all root rot is very important. And you want to bump up that potassium if it's low. And along with high soil pH, we'll get low manganese. And if that foliar material is tested for manganese, and if it's less than 32 parts per million, you'll need to go in there and fertilize with a magnesium sulfate or a sulfur application. And again, we tend to see this more readily in compacted soils. Those areas where there's high traffic tend to show up the take-all root rot more so than areas of less soil compaction. So here are a couple pictures of symptoms. Centipede on the left, and it tends to kind of be in a circular shape, but not necessarily. So what you see is just kind of a thinning area where turf density begins to decline and thin out. And, the symptom, it occurs over time, so it's not a rapid development. So sometimes you really don't pay attention to it until you start to see a significant area of reduced turf density. And then you go into those areas and you look at those plants and they're like dying. And over here on St. Augustine, again, kind of patchy, but you see the necrotic areas where the turf is dying, but also you see associated with this active infection, those surrounding areas that are chlorotic or turning yellow. And in these areas off to the left of the picture where it's turning kind of a yellowish color. And with that, you can go into these areas, and if anybody's ever tried to pull up stolons of St. Augustine grass, those roots are down in there pretty tight, and you've got to really pull with some strength to pull up that stolon. But what I tell my students and you all is one thing you can do out in that area, a home lawn or whatever your turf situation is, take-all root rot. If you grab that stolon in those areas around the perimeter of necrotic turf, they're going to lift off readily, just like if they're just not pegged in because those roots are rotted. A lot of times we'll see take-all root rot and large patch occurring about the same time of year in the fall. So one thing, again, I'd like to remind you is the take-all root rot, you can just readily lift that stolon, whether it's centipede grass or zoysia grass or St. Augustine grass, just readily lift it off. But again, if it's large patch and you try to do that, you're not going to lift that stolon, but those little plants on that stolon will slough off. So those are two little diagnostic rules of thumb you can use out in the turf situation to determine which disease it might be. Looking at the plant itself, the plant on the left is centipede grass, and you can see the stolon. And as you go down that stolon, from each of those crowns, you'll see just diminutive blackened roots. Not a lot of root material, not going to really work well in transporting water and nutrients up to that plant. So the plant starts to dry out, like you see in this lower, on this plant itself, the lower shoots start to dry down because it's basically a function of desiccation. And that's why we see the chlorosis occurring and then the necrosis in that progression, because they're basically desiccating. The picture on the right was a study we did with St. Augustine. The plant on the left was an untreated control, and then the plant on the right, you can see it's desiccated and browned out. There are roots there, but they're brittle and brown and not functioning. Therefore, the plant will die, and that's what's occurring in the turf. So how are we going to manage take all root rot? Because it is a root disease, it's a little bit challenging when we look at chemical control. So cultural management is very, very important. And the first thing we want to do is reduce compaction, alleviate the compression of that root system, core aerify to open new channels, get new root production going in those areas. Mowing height, again, is critical. Increase the mowing height if your turf is mowed too short, and that allows more surface leaf area, better photosynthesis, better production of that root system. In our home lawns, early on, this really started to become prominent in the late 90s, early 2000s. So a lot of different studies were going on, and one was top dressing with a very fine peat moss in those areas where there was no grass. And what that does is it helps promote a more acidic environment for that root system, because again, the disease is more prevalent under alkaline soils. Sometimes what we have seen has been so bad where you'd have to go in and with a sod cutter and remove those dead areas and replace it with healthy sod. But in doing so, you have to really make sure that you go deep enough to take that root and rhizome out of that environment, because that's where the fungus is. And early on, when we were working with this disease, several very old lawns in the Jackson, Mississippi area were just getting wiped out, and the lawn care operators were just coming through, and the homeowners wanted new sod, so they were resodding over those affected areas, leaving that bed of infected plant material, those roots and rhizomes. And you know, what happened over a short period of time, a couple growing seasons, the newly laid sod began to show the symptoms similar to what the original home lawn looked like. So it's very important to remove that infected material deep in the soil and then replace it with healthy sod. Acidifying fertilizers, if pH is a problem and you're in an area where it's very alkaline, use magnesium sulfate, acidifying fertilizers, ammonium sulfate to help bring up that pH in that area of that root zone. A good rule of thumb is a 1-to-1 nitrogen to potassium ratio. Again, potassium is important. And put it into a slow release formulation, so you're not, putting out a nitrogen that is readily available and soluble, and there's a quick uptake. And as far as water management, again, you want to avoid drought stress, but overwatering can then be a problem as well, because your typical reaction is if you see grass browning out, you think it might be desiccating, so you want to water it, and overwatering can turn into some problems as well. And turf situations, we don't have a lot of good options for fungicides, but we do have seen results with the strobilurins and the DMIs applied in the fall of the year and the spring of the year, and then thiophanate methyl. But all of these need to be watered in, and like Dr. Kearns was talking about, watering in for the nematodes, about 1/8 of an inch. You want to get that fungicide immediately into that root zone and get it to the place where the fungus is attacking. One that I don't have up here that we're looking at in golf course turf are the new SDHIs, and we're seeing good results with the Villistas, Lexicon, and Xterra Stress Guard. So moving from a root pathogen and disease, I'm going to hit a little bit on gray leaf spot. Dr. Kearns talked about it in tall fescue, which is really blowing up in the Carolinas. In the early 90s, that decade, we started to see gray leaf spot just annihilate perennial ryegrass to the point now where we have resistant varieties of perennial ryegrass. But in the deep south, St. Augustine, it's just been a perennial disease that can really wipe out and blight turf really bad. I have crabgrass here as a host because it does. This pathogen, Pericularia oryzae, will infect crabgrass. So if you have crabgrass infestation, the disease can occur on that crabgrass and move into your amenity turf grasses. We see this disease in the summertime when the temperatures are high and the humidity is very high. So for us right now, based on the last 30 plus days of frequent rainfall and just maintained high humidity, we are seeing just an exorbitant amount of gray leaf spot occurring on St. Augustine grass throughout the deep south. The symptoms we'll see are leaf spot, and you can see in this picture on the right, they start as small little areas, small little lesions, and they're typically down in the fold or on the margins where the water droplets occur during the nighttime or where humidity resides within that turf canopy. And then that disease progression can quickly cause a blighting of the leaf where it's just totally blighted out or scorched looking. And then it produces on that leaf this very classic fish hook or twisting of that blighted leaf. So when you see that in the turf, you know that gray leaf spot is present. If you look closely in lesion development, again, you'll see it primarily along the margin or in the fold of especially, the big St. Augustine grass leaf. But this is a classic symptom, and you could see this as well on tall fescue. Looks a little bit different on perennial ryegrass because that leaf is so narrow. But you can see this area, and in the center will be sporulation, and that's what's on the right. Asexual sporulation, these beautiful piriform little canidia that look like icicles or crystals, will create a grayish velvety appearance on that leaf, and that's why we call it gray leaf spot, due to the colonization and sporulation of that fungus within that lesion. Very specific conditions must occur for this fungus to get going and infect. And the temperature is 70 to 85 degrees and at least a 24-hour leaf wetness. So if it's raining, humidity's high, down in that leaf canopy, it's really not going to dry out as readily as if we had high pressure, real blue skies and low humidity. And this is a polycyclic disease. So that means once it gets started in the growing season in the summer, each of these little canidia will blow off and move to a new point on that leaf and start a new infection cycle. So this can occur over and over within a 7-day period from the point of landing on the leaf to infection to sporulation. And you can see the abundance of spores just on this very small magnification I've got in that right, that it's going to be widespread and it's going everywhere. So as long as we've got these environmental conditions and that susceptible host, we're going to have this disease. So what can we do to break that cycle? There's cultural management practices, and I'm going to focus on St. Augustine grass because that's the prevalent worm season grass in the deep south. You know, St. Augustine really doesn't need much nitrogen, so you don't want to push it, maybe 2 to 3 pounds per year, and that depends on where you are, whether it's at the most northern regions of growing St. Augustine down to the deep south into Texas, Florida, you might get up to 3 pounds per year. But really, you don't even have to put that much nitrogen on it. Minimize that leaf wetness through proper irrigation timing. So again, you don't want to start your irrigation in the early evening, and I'll drive through residential areas and I'll see about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock on a summer night, the irrigation going off, or even midday. And I'm just thinking, oh my goodness, that's just promoting foliar diseases. And if it's St. Augustine, it's going to be gray leaf spot. So you want to minimize that wetness period because, again, that fungus requires a 24-hour, it's really 16 hours, but within the 16 to 24-hour period of moisture, so it can land, infect, produce mycelium, start to colonize that plant and parasitize it. We do have resistant cultivars for turf type tall fescue and perennial ryegrass. And I do know that there's many studies out there with St. Augustine grasses looking at new genotypes. And one of the primary diseases they're looking at is resistance to gray leaf spot. So hopefully that will be in the near future for St. Augustine growers. So with the cultural management, we can couple that with chemical management. And we get very, very good control of gray leaf spot with the strobilurins. As Dr. Kearns mentioned, thiophenate methyl works very well on tall fescue. I've seen strobies work very well on St. Augustine grass. So perhaps it's the host type that changes that chemical efficacy. DMIs are labeled, but I would caution using them on the warm season grasses during the summertime. So with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation, see if there's any questions that you guys may have that I can entertain.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peterson. There is indeed a couple of questions. I'll go through that.
Okay.
The first question is it possible to do a preventative fungicide application for spring dead spot in warm season turf? And when would be the correct time to do this application if it is possible?
Oh, it's very much possible. And I didn't talk about spring dead spot, but again, it's kind of related to the take-all root rot. It's an ectotrophic root infecting fungus, so it's down, in the soil, infecting the roots. And the application timing, and you can get good control, especially under conditions where you don't have a very harsh winter. But even under harsh winters, you're still going to get some level of control. If you have mild winters, meaning cold temperatures, hard frost, long periods of dormancy, that's what I consider a hard winter. And if you don't spray a fungicide, you will see a considerable amount of spring dead spot symptoms versus if you did. In moderate to mild winters, if you don't spray a fungicide, you'll still see symptoms, but if you do, a fungicide application, you'll see reduced symptoms or possibly no symptoms at all. So the question is timing. So again, it depends on where you are in that zone of warm season grasses, but typically it'll follow the timing of the large patch, anywhere from the 3rd week of September, depending on how high up you are in the transition zone, down to even the first application towards the lower end of that growing region where you get dormancy. Typically down further south in Florida and Texas, spring dead spot's not a significant problem because it doesn't go into dormancy. So in our area, Starkville, Mississippi, that goes across Birmingham and kind of into that Atlanta zone. We target our first application in early October, around October 5th or 6th. And then again, we follow up with a second application 28 days later, or sometimes programs that we've looked at would be 21-day applications, putting 3 applications out. But typically, no matter what the fungicide is, if it's efficacious for spring dead spot, a 28-day application in the fall of the year, 2 applications seem to work the best. I've looked at studies and done studies where we looked at fall and spring applications. We get the same results putting out fall and spring applications. So let's save some money and just put 2 applications out in the fall of the year. About, rule of thumb, 60 days prior to dormancy, and then a second application 30 days prior to dormancy.
That's great. I have one more question. As the season moves along, could I get your opinion on the amount of nitrogen we should be applying throughout the hottest parts of the summer in Bermuda and zoysia grass?
Okay, very good management question. Bermuda grass, it likes nitrogen, and the rule of thumb is we put out in the best application is a slow release, and you want to target about between a half a pound and 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet during a month. And sometimes we've got these long release coated fertilizers that are now being used in home lawns and sports fields, where you could put out 1 application and you're going to get up to like almost a complete summer worth of slow release nitrogen. But you pretty much want to target, I like to see about a pound of nitrogen for Bermuda grass. But now zoysia grass, what we do in our area is we'll put out about a pound in May or June, depending on its green up, and kind of leave it alone in a slow release, and don't put out any more nitrogen for the rest of the growing season. Um, so, and again, it just depends on, in those turf situations with the zoysia grass, it might turn a little bit limey towards the end of the growing season. So if you like that greener, deeper color, you might come out with a second application of a half a pound in a slow release to finish off the growing season on your zoysia grass.
That's great. I don't have any more questions at this point. So I will give a few more seconds. If you have, you can chime in and write a few questions here, and I can ask Dr. Peterson.
Okay.
It looks like we don't have any more questions.